The patient in room 4 has been whispering my name for the last 23 minutes, and I have not told anyone because the patient in room 4 does not know my name. I have worked this ward for 14 months. I have never introduced myself to the patient in room 4. My name is not on any visible surface in this corridor, not on my badge which faces inward when I do my checks, not on any door, not on any board visible from behind the observation window of a locked room. My name is not something the patient in room 4 has any access to. And yet the whispering, which I first registered as the generalized murmur that the violent wing produces at 3 in the morning as a baseline condition, the ambient sound of people who do not sleep and do not stop and do not organize their vocalizations around the schedule of the waking world, has resolved in the last 23 minutes into something specific, into syllables, into my name, spoken quietly and repeatedly from behind the locked door of room 4, spoken in a register that is not distressed and not aggressive and not the register of any of the 14 months of this patient's documented presentation, but in a register that is calm, that is patient, that is the register of someone who is not asking but informing, not calling but confirming, as if the whispering of my name is not a request for my attention but an acknowledgement that my attention is already given, that wherever I am in this corridor, whatever door I am standing at, whatever check I am completing, something behind the locked door of room 4 is aware of my exact position and is noting it, continuously, with my name. I want to tell you about this job before I tell you what happens next, because the job requires context and the context requires honesty about what psychiatric ward work is and is not, what it asks of a person, what it does to a person over 14 months of nights, and what you learn in those 14 months about the line between the clinical and the something else that the clinical vocabulary does not have adequate words for, the something else that you encounter in facilities like this one. In the hours when the building is quietest and the people inside it are at their most themselves, which is the most frightening version of themselves, the version that exists when supervision is a single attendant doing 15-minute checks in a corridor that smells of industrial disinfectant and the specific human smell of people who live entirely inside a locked space. The facility is in a rural location. I am not going to name the state or the county because the facility is still operational and the patients inside it have rights that include the right not to be identified in documents like this one. What I will tell you is that it is remote in the specific way that rural psychiatric facilities are remote, which is not the romantic remoteness of wilderness, but the functional remoteness of an institution that requires distance from population centers for reasons that the administration would describe as therapeutic environment and that the staff describe after hours as plausible deniability, meaning that the distance between the facility and the nearest town is a distance that manages the community's relationship with the facility's existence, keeps it abstract, keeps it the place out on route, something that most people prefer to think of as little as possible. I drive 40 minutes each way, 4 nights a week, through the kind of dark that rural roads produce. The dark of no street lights and no ambient urban glow, just the beam of my headlights and the tree lines on either side and the stars above when it is clear, which it is not always. The violent wing is the northeast wing of the building, separated from the general population ward by 2 sets of coded doors and a staff checkpoint that is staffed during day and swing shifts and is covered by remote observation only during the overnight. My shift is 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. There are 2 of us on the violent wing overnight, myself and a woman named Patricia who has been here for 6 years and who has the kind of institutional knowledge that comes from 6 years of overnight shifts in a psychiatric facility, which is the knowledge of patterns, of what is normal, of what the building and the people in it are like in their most unguarded hours. Patricia and I split the checks, alternating rooms, every 15 minutes, through the corridor of 14 occupied rooms, 7 on each side, each room locked, each room with its observation window. Each check a pause at the window to confirm visual, to log the time, to move on. You do not enter rooms alone on the violent wing at night. You do not engage in extended conversations through doors. You do not stop walking for any reason other than a medical emergency. These are the rules. These are the rules that exist because the rules that do not exist are the ones that get people hurt. The additional rules, the ones that are not written down but are conveyed by Patricia on my first week in the way that veteran staff convey the real rules to new staff in facilities like this, are the ones I want to tell you about, because they are the rules that matter, that explain the 14 months that follow, that explain what I understand now that I did not understand when Patricia first explained them to me. The first unwritten rule is that you do not engage with any patient who knows your name before you have introduced yourself. Not through the door, not on the intercom, not in any way. You log it, you report it to the supervisor, and you treat it as a clinical observation. Patricia tells me this with the flat effect of someone delivering information rather than a warning, and I ask her if it has happened, and she says it has happened twice in her 6 years, both times in the first year, both times with patients who had been on the wing for less than 3 months. I ask what happened when those patients knew the names. She says the first one was transferred to a higher security facility within 6 weeks. I ask about the second one. She says the second one is still here. She does not say which room. She does not look at any specific door when she says this. She changes the subject with the efficiency of someone who has decided that a subject has received sufficient coverage. The second unwritten rule is that you complete every check in under 4 minutes regardless of what you hear. The 15-minute check cycle means 15 minutes between the completion of one round and the beginning of the next, and a 14-room check at a professional pace takes approximately 3 minutes and 45 seconds. Which leaves a margin of 15 seconds that Patricia is precise about maintaining. You do not linger. You do not pause at a door longer than it takes to achieve and log a visual. Whatever you hear through the door, whatever you see in the window, whatever the patient does in the observation window of their room at 3 in the morning, you log it, and you move on, and you do not vary the pace, because varying the pace is how you end up at the wrong place in the cycle, which is how you end up alone in a corridor of locked rooms with your check cycle off rhythm and the 14-room sequence broken. Patricia says this with such specificity that I ask her if the check cycle has ever gone off rhythm in her 6 years. She says once. I ask what happened. She says she finished the check and went to the break room and drank a cup of coffee and did not go back to the corridor for 11 minutes. And when she went back, the corridor was exactly as it should have been, and nothing was wrong, and nothing has been wrong since. She says this in the tone of a person who has made peace with something they did not fully understand and has decided that peace is the more functional response. I do not ask further questions. I understand that I have been given the information that is available, and that the information that is not available is the information that lives in the 11 minutes she does not describe. The third unwritten rule is the one that takes me the longest to understand, the one Patricia delivers last, on the final night of my first week, when she has assessed me as sufficiently prepared to receive it. The third rule is this: you do not count the doors. You check each room. You log each room. You move down the corridor from the first room to the last room, and you do not count the rooms because the corridor has 14 rooms, and the corridor has always had 14 rooms, and if at any point during your check the number of rooms you are counting does not match 14, you have made a mistake in your counting, and you should complete the round and reset and begin again. I ask her what kind of mistake a person could make in counting to 14. She looks at me for a long time. She says the kind of mistake that a person makes when they are tired and it is 3 in the morning and the lighting in the corridor is institutional fluorescent and every door looks exactly like every other door. I say, yes, of course. She nods. She says, yes, of course. And we both understand, in the way that two people understand something that neither of them is going to say out loud, that this third rule is not about miscounting. 6 months in, I know the corridor the way I know my own apartment. I know the sound of each room. I know the particular quality of silence that each patient produces in the deep night hours. I know which rooms have patients who sleep and which have patients who do not, who pace or who sit at the observation window and look out with the specific expression of the medication managed, the expression of a person who is present and absent simultaneously, who looks at you from behind glass with eyes that register your passing but do not reach through it. I have developed what I can only describe as the corridor sense, the full peripheral awareness of a 14-room space that comes from months of repetition in an environment that punishes inattention. I notice when something is different. I notice it before I know what is different, the way you notice a change in the air pressure before you know a storm is coming. What is different on the night of the whispering is room 4. Room 4 contains a patient who has been on the violent wing for 4 months. A patient whose documented presentation includes periods of extended vocalization, which is the clinical language for the condition of continuous or semi-continuous talking or sound production, and whose vocalizations are typically either directed at staff in an angry and aggressive register or are internally directed, meaning not aimed at anyone visible. The vocalization of someone in conversation with a person or persons present in the patient's experience, but not in the observable environment. I am familiar with this patient's vocalizations. I have heard them every night for 4 months. Every 15-minute check, the recognizable sound of a specific person's voice at its various registers, the angry, the internal, the distressed. I know this patient's voice the way you know any voice you have heard hundreds of times in the particular conditions of late-night institutional quiet. I know it, and it does not sound like what I am hearing now. What I am hearing is not in any of the documented registers. It is quiet. It is precise. It is my name, spoken at a pace of approximately 1 repetition every 4 seconds, and it begins on my second check of the night, at 12:14, and is present on every subsequent check through 3 a.m., through 3:15, through 3:30, my name every 4 seconds from behind the locked door of room 4. And the patient who does not know my name produces it with an accuracy that I am standing in the corridor at 3:32 in the morning trying to explain to myself with. Decreasing success. I have considered every explanation. Patients in facilities like this one sometimes learn staff names through observation, through other patients, through overheard conversations. The explanation is possible. The explanation does not account for the specific delivery, the pace, the register, the quality of the whispering, which is not the quality of a learned word being produced, but the quality of a known name being spoken by a person who has always known it, who has known it longer than I have been working this corridor, who is speaking it not to summon, but to demonstrate knowledge, to let me know, each time I pass the door at my 15-minute intervals, that whatever is behind it knows exactly who is passing. At 3:47, I break the second unwritten rule. I stop at the door of room 4. I do not engage. I do not speak through the door. I do not use the intercom. But I stop and I look through the observation window, and the patient is in the bed, lying down, facing the ceiling, eyes open, and the whispering is continuous and the patient's mouth is moving with each repetition of my name at its 4-second intervals, and the patient's eyes, which are fixed on the ceiling, do not move toward the window, do not acknowledge my presence at the glass, do not indicate any awareness that I am standing at the door, and the whispering does not stop and does not change and does not modify for my presence at the window in any way, which is the thing that I stand at the window looking at for 31 seconds before I register what it means, which is that the whispering is not for my benefit. The patient is not whispering my name at the door because the patient knows I am at the door. The patient is whispering my name because the patient knows where I am in the corridor at every moment, because the patient knows where I am at 3:47 when I am at the window, and at 3:32 when I am 3 doors down, and at 3:17 when I am at the far end of the corridor by rooms 13 and 14. And the whispering is not a communication directed at me, but a continuous location report directed at something else, something that the patient knows can hear it. Something that my name in the patient's mouth represents not as identity, but as coordinates. And I stand at the window of room 4 for 31 seconds understanding this. And then I complete the Rule 2 violation by making it worse, by doing the thing you are never supposed to do, by speaking through the door. I say stop. One word. Quiet enough that it does not carry down the corridor. The whispering stops. The patient's eyes, still fixed on the ceiling, do not move. The room is silent for the first time since 12:14. And in the silence, the patient's mouth, which has stopped its repetition of my name, opens slightly further and produces something else, something that is not my name, something that takes me a moment to parse because it is not a word in a language I speak and is not immediately interpretable as language at all, but has the structure of language, the cadence of a sentence, the weight of a statement. And as I stand at the window, it resolves into a pattern of sound that my brain is generating. Meaning around, and the meaning it generates is not the meaning of the patient addressing me, but the meaning of the patient relaying a message, repeating something it has been told to repeat, translating from somewhere into the closest available approximation. And the approximation carries enough of the original that I take 2 involuntary steps backward from the window and hit the corridor wall behind me and stand with my back against the wall looking at the door of room 4 while the silence in the room holds and the observation window reflects the corridor lighting back at me and shows me my own face, pale, which is how I know the look of a person who has just been told something by a locked door that the locked door should not know. Patricia finds me at the wall. She has heard the silence, the break in the ambient sound of the corridor that the absence of the whispering has produced, and she has come from the nursing station to find me. She looks at me against the wall. She looks at the door of room 4. She looks at me again. She says, "You stopped." I say yes. She says, "You spoke through the door." I say yes. She does not say anything else for a long moment. Then she says, "Come to the nursing station." I follow her to the nursing station and she makes 2 cups of coffee from the machine and puts one in front of me and sits down and looks at her own cup for a while before she says, "What did it say?" Not what did the patient say. What did it say? I tell her the sound, the cadence, the approximation my brain generated. She listens without expression. She drinks her coffee. She says, "The first patient, the one who was transferred." She says it said something similar. Not the same. Similar. I say, "And the second patient, the one who is still here." She looks at her coffee. She says, "The second patient stopped speaking entirely after the first week." Selectively mute, the file says. I say, "You mean the patient chose not to speak again after whatever happened in the first week?" She does not answer that. She says, "Finish your coffee. We have 4 more checks before handoff." I finish my coffee. I complete the 4 checks. Room 4 is silent for the remainder of the night. The patient lying in the same position, eyes open, fixed on the ceiling, mouth closed, and the silence from that room has a quality that is harder to be in the corridor with than the whispering was, because the whispering was at least a sound I could orient to, a sound that told me what was happening. And the silence tells me nothing except that whatever was happening has concluded on its own terms in a way that has nothing to do with my 2 steps backward, or my cup of coffee, or the 4 remaining checks before handoff, and that the conclusion is entirely its own, arrived at for its own reasons, finished with what it needed and no longer in need of the corridor, or the checking, or the name. I write my incident report. I describe a patient vocalization incident in room 4, a typical register, duration approximately 3 hours and 33 minutes, spontaneously resolved. I describe my own rule violation, the pause, the verbal interaction through the door. I do not describe the sound the patient made in the silence. I do not describe what my brain generated as meaning from that sound. The incident report does not have a field for those things, and I have learned in 14 months that the things without fields are the things you carry home in the dark on the 40-minute drive through the rural roads. The things you bring into your apartment and set down in the corner and find still there when you wake up in the afternoon for your next shift, and that carrying them is the job, the actual job. The job underneath the protocol and the rules and the 15-minute checks. The job of being a person who goes to a place where the line between the clinical and the something else is thinner than any training prepares you for, and who crosses that shift after shift and drives home in the dark and comes back and does it again. I am still working the violent wing. Room 4 still has its patient. The patient has not whispered my name again in the 8 months since that night, and I do not know whether this represents improvement in the clinical sense or completion in some other sense, and I have decided, in the way that Patricia decided about her 11 minutes, to make peace with not knowing, to carry it as the third unwritten rule asks me to carry the number of doors in the corridor correctly and without examination, letting the corridor be 14 rooms and letting the night of the whispering be the thing it was and not the thing it might be if I look at it too directly. Because some things in the night require the same strategy that the third rule requires, which is completion without counting, forward movement without the inventory that would tell you something. The movement is better performed without knowing. Story number 2. The call bell in room 7 has been going off for 40 seconds, and room 7 has been empty since 11:15 p.m. when I completed the final documentation for its last occupant and turned off the bedside lamp and folded the top sheet and closed the door. And it is now 3:44 in the morning, and the call bell from room 7 is sounding at the nurse's station, and I am sitting beside my patient in room 9, Mrs. Eleanor Marsh, 81 years old, 6 days into her final admission, and she is telling someone named Thomas that the light is very beautiful tonight. And Thomas, as far as I can determine from every instrument available to me and every sense I possess, is not in this room. I want to be very clear about who I am and what I know before I go further, because what I know shapes what I am about to tell you, and what I am about to tell you requires that you understand the frame through which I received it. I am a hospice nurse. I have been a hospice nurse for 9 years, working overnight shifts for the last 6 of those years. First in a hospital-based palliative care unit in Portland, and for the past 3 years in a freestanding hospice facility in the north of Seattle, a converted residential building in a quiet neighborhood of tall trees in the particular Pacific Northwest, wet that makes everything slightly reflective at night. The wet streets and the wet leaves and the wet air carrying the sounds of the city in a muffled, distorted way that makes the facility feel more remote than its address suggests. I am a nurse. I am a scientist in the applied sense, meaning I organize my understanding of what I observe through the framework of physiology and pharmacology and the documented processes of human biology at the end of its function. I tell you this because the things I am going to describe are things that a person with my framework has already processed through every available clinical filter, and what remains after the clinical filtration is what I am going to tell you. And I am telling you not because I have conclusions, but because I have experiences, and the experiences do not resolve into conclusions the way clinical observations are supposed to resolve. And the not resolving is the most important thing about them. The overnight hospice shift is its own world. If you have not worked it, you have perhaps accompanied someone you love through a final admission, through the facility version of dying, the managed version, the version with the adjusted lighting and the comfort medications, and the staff who have been trained to sit with a dying person with the kind of presence that is not clinical distance and is not emotional collapse, but is something specific to this work, a quality of witness, of company, of being with that the nurses who stay in this specialty develop over time the way any specialized skill develops, through repetition and reflection and the gradual refinement of what presence means in a room where a person is leaving. That quality of witness is the central competency of hospice nursing, and it is the thing that the overnight shift asks of you most completely, because the overnight shift is when the most deaths occur, when the body systems make their final decisions in the deep hours, when the families who have been sitting bedside for days finally go home to sleep, and the patient, somehow, with a timing that is too consistent to be coincidence, chooses that interval to go, to complete the process in the privacy of the witness professional rather than the witnessed family. And you are the witness, and you are with them. And what you see in those hours is the thing that either ends your career in this specialty or makes it the only work you can imagine doing. And there is no middle ground, no gradual relationship. You know which one you are within the first year. I knew within the first month. I knew when Mrs. Kwan, my third patient in my first hospice facility, a woman of 77 with the specific fierce dignity of a person who has decided exactly how she is going to leave, looked at the corner of her room at approximately 4 in the morning and smiled in a way she had not smiled in the 17 days of her admission, a smile that was addressed to something in the corner of the room that I could not see, and said, in a voice that was stronger than her voice had been for a week, "I am not afraid," and died 8 minutes later with her eyes still oriented toward the corner of the room, still holding whatever she had seen there with a specificity of gaze that I cannot explain as the random eye movement of a failing nervous system because it was too directed, too sustained, too full of the quality of recognition for that explanation to fully satisfy. I filed it in my clinical notes as patient expressed decreased anxiety in final hours, consistent with documented patterns of terminal lucidity. I filed it correctly. What Mrs. Marsh has been talking to Thomas intermittently since approximately 2 in the morning. These conversations are not continuous. They come in intervals, a few minutes of dialogue with someone I cannot see or hear, then a rest period, then a return. The dialogue is one-sided in the way that a phone call is one-sided, meaning I hear her half of it and infer from her responses and reactions the content of the other half. And the other half, as I infer it, is gentle, is familiar, is the conversation of two people who know each other very well and have a great deal of history between them and no urgency about covering it all at once. She says his name occasionally. She says things like, "Yes, I know," and in a little while, "and the children," with a tone that suggests she is reporting on the children rather than asking about them, updating Thomas on the children the way you update someone who has been away for a while. She tells him the light is very beautiful tonight, which is, in the context of what terminal patients describe, exactly the kind of statement the literature prepares me for. The call bell from room 7 is not in the literature. The call bell in room 7 is a physical mechanism, a button connected to a wire connected to a panel at the nurse's station, and the button requires pressure, deliberate applied pressure, to activate. It does not activate on its own. It does not activate from air movement or vibration or electrical fluctuation, because it was tested for exactly those failure modes after the last time it sounded from an empty room, which was 16 months ago, before I joined this facility, in which the maintenance log records as a wiring fault, now repaired. The button requires pressure. The button in room 7 has received pressure at 3:44 in the morning, and room 7 is empty and has been empty since 11:15 p.m., and the door is closed and the lights are off, and there is no one in room 7. I tell Mrs. Marsh I will be right back. She does not acknowledge this. She is looking at the space beside her bed, the space where Thomas appears to be, and she is listening to something, her head tilted slightly in the way of a person attending carefully to a voice. And I leave the room and go to the nurse's station, and I look at the panel, and room 7's indicator is lit, and I acknowledge the bell, and I go to the corridor, and I stand outside the door of room 7, and I put my hand on the door handle. The corridor at 3:44 in the morning in a hospice facility in the north of Seattle has a quality of quiet that is distinct from ordinary quiet. It is the quiet of a building where people are sleeping and not sleeping, where some of the people are sleeping in the ordinary way, and some of them are sleeping in the way that is the approach to a longer sleep, and the building carries both kinds of sleeping in its air, in the specific quality of its night silence. And the corridor outside room 7 has that quiet sitting in it, and I stand in it with my hand on the door handle for a moment before I open the door. Room 7 is empty. The light from the corridor falls across the made bed, the folded top sheet, the cleared bedside table, the equipment that has been disconnected and wheeled to the wall. The room is exactly as I left it at 11:15. The call bell button on the bedside panel is in its normal unpressed position. The window, which in a hospice room can be opened from the inside and is equipped with a restrictor that limits opening to 4 inches, is closed. The room is empty and it is cold, colder than the corridor, colder than the HVAC setting for this room. And I stand in the doorway and the cold comes out of the room and I breathe it and it smells of the room's clean state and something under the clean state, something that is the residue of occupancy, the specific molecular trace of a person having been in a space that no amount of cleaning entirely removes, and that in a hospice room is the trace of the particular person who was last in it. And I know whose trace it is because I have been a hospice nurse for 9 years and I know the residue of specific occupancy the way a vintner knows a specific grape in a wine. And the person whose trace I am breathing in the cold air of empty room 7 died in this room 4 days ago and has not been in this room since 11:15 p.m. tonight when I folded the sheet and turned off the lamp. I go back to room 9. Mrs. Marsh is looking at the space beside her bed and she has stopped talking, which in the context of the pattern of this night is a rest interval. And she is resting with her eyes open and oriented toward the space, and her expression is the expression of someone who is comfortable in the company of what they are looking at. And I sit back down in the chair beside her bed, and I note the time, and I note her vitals on my tablet, and I document the bell activation in room 7 as equipment check. Required, no finding. And I sit in the chair, and I am in the quality of witness that 9 years of this work has developed in me. And Mrs. Marsh rests for 11 minutes. And then she begins talking to Thomas again, and this time I listen differently than I have listened before tonight. Not clinically, not through the literature, not through the framework of documented patterns and neurological processes, but with the quality of attention I use in the corridor of the hospice at 3 in the morning when the building is most completely itself, the quality of a person. Mrs. Marsh dies at 5:22 in the morning. It is a good death, which is the language this work uses for a death that proceeds without distress, without acute pain, without the specific suffering that a bad death involves, a death that has been managed correctly and that the patient moves through with a quality of ease that is sometimes described by families as peaceful and is described by nurses with more time in the work as something for which peaceful is an approximate but insufficient word, a word that gestures at something that does not have a better word in common usage. She dies with her eyes oriented toward the space beside the bed. She dies saying a name that is not Thomas, a name I do not recognize, a name that is not in her file, not in her family documentation, not in anything I have access to, a name she says in the specific tone of greeting, the tone of recognizing someone expected, the tone of yes, you, I see you, I knew you would come. And then she is gone in the way that people are gone in this work, a quality change in the room, a shift in the air, the body present and the person not. The absolute unambiguous distinction between those two states that 9 years of hospice nursing teaches you to recognize in the instant of its occurrence. I complete my documentation. I notify the family. I prepare the room with the respect and efficiency that this work requires. I make my notes precise and clinical and complete. I note the call bell activation in room 7 at 3:44 as equipment, no finding. I note Mrs. Marsh's terminal lucidity, her vocalizations, her quality of ease in the final hours, her death time of 5:22. What I do not note is the name she said, the name I did not recognize, because the name has no clinical field and no clinical significance, and is not something the documentation system has a place for. And what I carry home with it in the Pacific Northwest morning, in the gray early light and the wet air and the trees reflecting the dawn on their surfaces, is the specific quality of what I witnessed in room 9. Not the clinical event, but the shape of the pauses in Mrs. Marsh's conversation. The gap that had 3 participants, the visitor from room 7 who joined a conversation that was already in progress and stayed until the conversation was complete. And I carry it home, and I set it in the corner of the room where I live with all the other things I carry from 9 years of nights in rooms where people leave, and the corner is getting full, and I am not sure the word peaceful is ever going to be quite sufficient again. But I am also not sure it was ever meant to be, and I go to sleep in the morning light, and I come back in the evening, and I sit with the next patient who needs someone to sit with them, and I am there, which is the work, which is the whole of the work, which is enough. Story number 3. The blood under the second trauma bay gurney has been there for 40 minutes, and it is my job to make it not be there, and I am on my knees at 4 in the morning in a high-crime area of the Bronx with a mop and a biohazard kit, and the smell of it is the smell that I have been breathing for 3 years of overnight ER tech work, and that I still have not made my peace with. The specific compound of blood and antiseptic and the sweat of a trauma response, and behind me through the double doors. The next case is already in radio contact with the ambulance bay, always coming in on Friday nights in this neighborhood. Always another one. And outside the sirens are the background track of this entire borough at 4 in the morning, constant and overlapping and present enough that I no longer consciously register individual sirens, but register instead their absence. Register the moments of siren quiet as anomalies, as the gaps in the city's pulse that mean either that nothing is happening or that something has happened that has made the sirens unnecessary. And at 4 in the morning on a Friday in the Bronx, the gaps are rare, and when they come, I notice them the way you notice a held breath. I want to tell you about this job with the honesty it deserves, which is the honesty of someone who chose it with full knowledge and has stayed with it with full knowledge and has no interest in either dramatizing or minimizing what it involves. Because both the dramatization and the minimization are ways of not seeing it clearly. And not seeing it clearly is the luxury of people who do not work it. And I have not had that luxury for 3 years. The overnight ER tech in a high-crime area of New York City is the person who makes the emergency room function in the gaps between the moments that are visible in the cultural narrative of emergency medicine, in the gaps between the dramatic interventions and the decisive diagnoses and the saves and the losses that populate the stories people tell about this work. I am in the gaps. I clean the rooms between patients so the next patient's care is not compromised by the previous patient's biology. I transport patients between units. I draw blood and run ECGs and assist with procedures and manage the supply chain that keeps the department equipped for whatever the city decides to bring through the doors on any given night. I have done this for 3 years in a department that operates at a level of trauma volume and acuity that would be considered catastrophic in most parts of the country, and that is the baseline condition here. The normal operating state of an ER that serves a neighborhood with a specific intersection of poverty and violence and inadequate access to preventive care that produces the patient population I have been working with for 3 years. I know these patients. I know this neighborhood. I am from 2 miles north of this hospital. I have been to school with people who have come through these doors on gurneys. I have held pressure on wounds of people whose mothers I have met at family events. I have been the last face seen by people who went to elementary school in the same building I did. This is the context of the job, and the context is not separate from the horror of what I am going to tell you. It is the frame that makes the horror legible. That explains why what happened at 4:27 in the morning on a Friday in October was not just frightening, but was something that I have been turning over in the 3 months since, and that still does not have a clean edge, does not resolve into a frame that lets me look at it from outside. The second trauma bay is the larger of the 2 trauma rooms, equipped for multi-person response, capable of running simultaneous stabilization on 2 critical patients with the full complement of attending, resident, nurses, and techs that a major trauma requires. It is the room that the most serious cases go to, the room with the most comprehensive equipment, the room with the most history in its walls, and the overnight tech who cleans it between cases, is alone with that history in the 4 a.m. quiet between the sirens. The quiet that is never long enough and never comfortable because you know it ends, and the ending is always another person in crisis. Always another case on the radio from the ambulance bay, and the cleaning you are doing is preparation. For them, for the person you have not yet met who is going to need this room to be clean and functional when they arrive. I am cleaning the second trauma bay at 4:27 in the morning when the door opens. The door to the second trauma bay opens inward and has a pneumatic closer that returns it to the closed position slowly but completely. And when someone opens it from outside, you hear the closer's resistance first, the slight pneumatic sigh, and then the sweep of the door, and then the return swing and the latch. I hear all of this at 4:27, and I look up from the floor, and the door is in the process of its return swing, and the room is empty. No one has come through. The door has opened fully to its maximum extension and is returning to the closed position, and the room is empty. I look at the door. It completes its return and latches. I look at the space the door has swept through. I look at the equipment side of the room, the crash cart, the procedure lights on their articulating arms, the monitoring equipment on its tower. I look at the secondary gurney, which is positioned against the east wall. There is no one in this room. I get off my knees. I stand. I am holding the mop, and I am standing in the second trauma bay at 4:27, and the door is closed, and the room is empty, and I am the only person in it. And the sirens outside are at their 4 a.m. constant, and the fluorescent lights overhead are at their full overnight brightness. The unmediated flat brightness of institutional lighting at full power, which is the lighting that is supposed to make you see clearly and completely, which is the lighting under which there should be no ambiguity about the contents of a room. And the contents of this room are me and my mop and the equipment and the door that just opened and closed for no person. I check the door. The pneumatic mechanism is functioning normally. There is no malfunction that would cause the door to self-open, which requires overcoming the pneumatic resistance of the closer, which is not a resistance that malfunctions by spontaneously reversing. The door opens from outside pressure. I open and close it 3 times. It closes completely every time. It does not self-open. I leave it closed and I go back to cleaning, and I am on my knees at the secondary gurney, the gurney against the east wall, and I am running the cleaning solution across the floor under the gurney frame, and I am looking at the floor and at the wheels of the gurney and at the base of the east wall, and I see the handprint. It is on the base of the east wall, approximately 6 inches above the floor, at the level that a hand would occupy if a person were lying on the floor with their arm extended, pressing their palm flat against the wall. The handprint is in blood, not fresh blood. The blood has a different character from the blood that is on the floor from the patient of 40 minutes ago, a different color, a different viscosity in the way dried blood reads differently, depending on how long it has been drying. And this blood has been drying longer than 40 minutes. This handprint is from an earlier case, from an earlier patient in this room, from someone who was on the floor of the second trauma bay at some point before tonight. And it has survived the cleaning of that case, survived the post-case biohazard protocol, survived whatever cleaning was done after that case closed, and has been on the base of the east wall at 6 inches above the floor, hidden by the position gurney, for however long the blood's character indicates. I photograph it. I am required to photograph any biohazard finding discovered during cleaning, and I photograph it with my phone, and I am looking at the photograph, and the handprint is clear, a left hand, for fingers and a thumb, pressed flat against the wall with what I can infer from the pressure distribution in the dried blood was considerable force, was a hand pressing against the wall with the force of someone who needed the wall to be there, who needed something solid, who was on the floor of the second trauma bay pressing their hand flat against the east wall at 6 inches above the floor level with the force of someone who was holding on, and the realization of what I am looking at, the specific understanding of the context in which that hand pressed that wall, arrives in me fully and physically, and I am on my knees in the second trauma bay at 4:27 in the morning, holding my phone with the photograph on it, and I am looking at the handprint, and the handprint is looking back at me. With the specific quality of an impression, of a record, of something left by a person in a moment that was the most important moment of their experience. And the something that was left is still here, below the gurney, at 6 inches above the floor, in the room that the door just opened for and let no one through. I clean the handprint. I am required to clean it. It is a biohazard, and I am the biohazard tech, and the cleaning of it is my function, and I clean it with the correct solution and the correct technique, and I photograph the clean surface, and I log the finding and the remediation in the department's cleaning record, and I finish the secondary gurney, and I finish the floor, and I stand up, and I am done with the second trauma bay, and the radio from the ambulance bay crackles the next case, and I push the mop bucket to the corridor, and I go to receive the next patient, and I am functional, and I am professional, and I am present for the case, and I am present for the cases after it through the rest of the overnight, and I am fine. I am fine in the way that this job requires you to be fine, which is the operational fine of a person who has made the choice to be in a room with the weight of what this room carries, and who continues to function in it, and I am fine. But I think about the door. I think about it at 4:27 in the morning in the specific way I have described, standing in the second trauma bay with my mop, and I think about it in the months since, in the particular way that things you have no explanation for lodge in the mind and resist the pressure you put on them to resolve. The door opened. No one came through. 6 inches above the floor on the east wall, below the gurney that had been positioned against it, a left hand had pressed the wall with everything it had in the moment that it pressed it. And the door, pneumatically closed, requiring external pressure to open, had opened at 4:27 in the morning for no one I could see, and returned to its closed position with its ordinary pneumatic sigh. And the room had been empty, and I had been in it. And whatever came through the door when it opened was something I was not equipped to see and was not equipped to address with a mop and a biohazard kit, but that was there. That occupied the room with me for whatever interval it occupied it, that knew where the handprint was on the east wall 6 inches above the floor, and that came back to this room on a Friday night in October to find it cleaned away, and found me instead, and the finding was brief and conclusive on both sides. And I finished cleaning and went to receive the next patient, and I come back every shift, and the door has not opened again unprompted. And I clean under the secondary gurney every time with a thoroughness that the protocol requires, and that I would now perform regardless of the protocol. And the east wall 6 inches above the floor level is always clean, always addressed, and I am always the person addressing it. And I consider that a form of respect that I cannot fully articulate, but that feels, on the nights when the sirens are constant and the trauma bay fills and empties and fills again, like the most important thing I do in this department, the thing underneath the clinical function, the acknowledgement of what these walls have absorbed from the hands that have pressed them in the worst moments, and the understanding that cleaning a room is not the same as emptying it, and that I am never, at 4 in the morning in the second trauma bay, entirely alone.